Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kathy Hughes. I'm a principal researcher with the American Institutes for Research, and that is AIR, not AIR. We are a not-for-profit research and technical assistance organization. We have about 1,500 employees around the world, and our mission is to generate and use evidence for a better, more equitable world. And I'm joined today by James Kemple from the Research Alliance for New York City Schools at NYU, and I'll introduce him more thoroughly in a moment. But first, I want to tell you a bit about the CTE Research Network that is sponsoring this webinar today. Our goal is to expand the evidence base on CTE by promoting and disseminating causal research. And we are funded by the U.S. Department of Education, by the Institute for Education Sciences, and that's the nonpartisan research arm of the U.S. Department of Education, which rightfully saw that while there is a lot of research on CTE, most of it has been correlational or descriptive or qualitative, and there's a real need for causal studies that could really show, does CTE cause students to have outcomes that are different than they otherwise would have had without CTE? And that's the question that we want to answer. And does CTE benefit students? Which students in which contexts? So this network was funded with 6 participating research teams. Next slide, please, Tara. You can see the 6 studies that we have underway. One focuses on the technical high schools in Connecticut. The second one you see is the one that you're going to hear about today. CTE in New York City. We have a study by MDRC on the P-TECH 9 to 14 schools, and a study focused on the statewide dual enrollment program in North Carolina. We have another webinar coming up Tuesday, March 5th, that will look at the findings from those 2 studies, the P-TECH and the Career and College Promise studies. The final 2 studies we do not yet have findings for. They're still underway, but stay tuned. We will eventually have some results from those. Also coming up, next slide, please, Tara. We have reviewed all of the causal research on CTE of the last 20 years, and we expect to release that report not just later this year, but hopefully later this month. We'll see. It's in process. We will have that out soon. And we also want to let you know about a convening a month from today, March 20th in Crystal City. This is a day-long meeting in conjunction with ACTE's National Policy Seminar. Our day on Wednesday the 20th, that is a free day. There is no fee to attend that day. And we will be sharing research results. We're going to hear from practitioner partners. We have U.S. Department of Education officials there, and really having a great conversation about what is the value of all of the evidence that the network has been producing of the last few years, and how does the field respond, and what do we still need to know in CTE research. So you are welcome to register for that. Registration is open. It would be great to see you there. And one final thing, exciting news. Next slide, please, Tara. We have been awarded the next iteration of the network. We're calling it the CTE Research Network 2.0. You see the partners here, and we're going to be continuing the great work of the current network, continuing to serve as a hub for CTE research, training, leadership, and dissemination. We don't yet know who the participating research teams will be. We'll know that later this year. So please stay tuned and come to our website for both the original CTE Research Network and 2.0. So let me now introduce Dr. Jim Kemple. He was until recently the executive director of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools. He's now a senior fellow at the Research Alliance. He's really well known in the field, a leader of this field for decades, and for his work examining high school reform, trends in New York City's education landscape, and of course, designing rigorous impact evaluations, causal studies. He is the principal investigator for this study that you're going to hear about, assessing the implementation, impact, and variation of CTE innovation, New York City as a lab for rigorous research. Before he joined the Research Alliance, he spent more than 18 years at MDRC, the director of MDRC's K-12 education policy area, and he was the principal investigator for MDRC's Career Academy evaluation, among other evaluations. So Jim, thank you for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. And it's a delight to see, to have folks online and interested in the kinds of work that we're doing. I'm going to share my screen here so that people can get some access to the slide deck that I'll be using. And I'm hoping people are looking at a slide that says learning from variation and diversity in CTE programming and participants, evidence from New York City. And I'm seeing a thumbs up from Tara Smith, who's going to keep me on track and make sure that I'm able to address questions that are going to come up. I should also mention that my colleague John Sludden is on the call. And John will, if you type some questions into the chat, he'll try to respond to some of those through the chat. If not, he'll kind of save them up. And I've got a few natural breakpoints where folks can interject questions. And I think maybe it'd work best if folks had clarifying questions as I go through some of what we've learned from New York City. And then we'll have some discussion and sort of wider ranging Q&A toward the end of the session here. So I'm really delighted to share some of what we have been learning from the New York City public schools over the last 5 or 6 years. This is a project that's been undertaken in collaboration with colleagues at the Research Alliance, John Sludden and Claire Buckley-Flack, as well as Sean Doherty at Boston College and Becky Unterman at MDRC. And in addition to terrific colleagues in the New York City public schools, I'll talk a bit about what makes this such a rich context from which to learn about what works, what doesn't, or what are the conditions under which career and technical education may be more or less effective and for whom. And as I go through that, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on our project and then dive into some of the findings. So this is a 6-year project. The goal, as I said, is to identify some conditions under which the career and technical education framework is more or less effective and for whom's. In addition, we have a really extensive assessment of CTE-related costs for the high schools that are implementing career technical education programs of study and trying to understand better the cost effectiveness of CTE. And again, the idea here is to learn as much as we can from the variation represented in the New York City public schools. I want to be clear, though, that this project is not an assessment of a CTE system or CTE's overall efficacy in New York City. It's really intended to try to learn from that context about some conditions that may enhance or limit CTE's capacity to improve college and career readiness. Today, I'm going to talk particularly about school contexts, their implementation, and the alignment between the career themes and career programming, the kinds of occupations that students may be able to pursue based on the kinds of educational attainment they're able to get through the CTE programs. Like the network, this is a project supported by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. And if you're interested in any of the reports from this project, one of which will be forthcoming, another of which I should say is it will be forthcoming in the next couple of weeks, I've listed the web address for the Research Alliance, and I'll have that again available at the end of the slide deck, and the slides will be made available to everybody when the C-Turn network puts together the video and the other pieces of their series here in March. So let's first talk about, what are we talking about here when we talk about the variation represented in the New York City public schools as it pertains to career and technical education. So I'll talk about 3 dimensions of that, and later on you'll see some findings about the impact of CTE under different kinds of conditions that I'll talk a bit about here. And three strands here around school context, career and technical education implementation and programming, and thirdly around the policy context and the alignment with occupations. So first and foremost, in New York City, there are two strands of high schools that offer career and technical education. One are high schools that are fully committed to CTE programming and to ensuring that students who are in those schools complete the coursework, work-based learning, the partnerships with local employers, working with certified teachers, and having the opportunity to engage in dual enrollment or college course taking while they're in high school. And we are going to include 37 of those high schools in this study. Which is going to encompass 80 different career and technical education programs of study. Many of these high schools offer more than one program of study. The study is going to focus on about 18,000 students who applied for one of these high schools and were ultimately assigned to one of the programs offering a CTE program of study in these high schools between 2013 and 2016. And we're going to compare the experiences of those students with another 18,000 students who were also interested in the programs in these CTE dedicated high schools. But because of the oversubscription, they were assigned to another high school program, not in a CTE dedicated high school or even offering CTE, that was included on their list of choices in their high school applications at the end of 8th grade. The other context within which CTE is offered are what we are classifying as comprehensive high schools, where a CTE program of study is one among a number of other curricular and programming options for young people in those schools. And for this piece of our study, we've got 26,000, a little over 26,000 students who applied for a program in these comprehensive high schools that offered CTE, and then were ultimately assigned to that program between 2013 and 2016. And we'll compare the experiences of those students and the outcomes of those 26,000 students with another 26,000 students who also listed these programs on their applications, or a program in these high schools on their applications, but were assigned to another program or school not offering CTE. The second piece of variation is around the CTE programming across these more than 100 or so programs of study. The variation included variation in the kinds of courses and course sequences that were being offered, the work-based learning opportunities that were being made available to students, the post-secondary education and employer partnerships, opportunities to take college courses through dual enrollment while they were still in high school, and getting access to teachers who were connected to industry, either in a former career or through their certification. We also see variation in the degree to which the high school, particularly the comprehensive high schools, were or were not kind of, quote, saturated with CTE students. Many of the comprehensive high schools had a single program of study, which included only a small proportion of the students in that high school. Other comprehensive high schools had several programs of study that included a majority or more of the students in that high school. And we think that kind of peer environment may also be connected to the difference in CTE effectiveness. We see huge variation in student course taking and the degree to which students are taking the number of courses usually classified for them to be a concentrator, a CTE concentrator. And we see huge variation across these programs and schools in student participation in internships and other work-based learning opportunities. And all this variation, we think, is a unique opportunity to learn. Many people, and researchers in particular, think about variation as the real challenge to doing rigorous research, because you don't have uniformity that allows you to look at the average effect of something as being capturing something consistent across places. And certainly the average does matter, and we do pay attention to that, but we think, at least in the context of these studies, that the variation provides, particularly in New York City, a unique opportunity to learn about the degree to which that variation is associated with differences in effects. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in our findings. We see variation in the policy context within which the schools were created or operated. initially, and the types of occupations with which their career themes are aligned, especially in terms of the kinds of education that are typically required for an entry-level job. In the policy context, New York City, as some of you may know, has undergone a massive transformation of its high school system. Beginning in 2002, the city closed a large proportion of its low-performing, very large high schools and opened in their place more than 200 new small schools that were usually not selective or not using test scores and other performance criteria to admit students. And the CTE reforms in the city went along with that by creating nearly 16 new CTE dedicated high schools, along with many other CTE programs in the comprehensive high schools beginning in 2008, built on the same small school model using non-selective admissions criteria. In the meantime, they continue to operate large high schools that were typically more selective and often had a range of career themes across the schools, whereas the smaller, less selective programs that were newer typically had a more focused sort of set of career themes. In occupational alignment, we matched up each of the career themes with its appropriate curricular identification codes, and matched those up with the kinds of occupations that would be associated with those career clusters, and then looked at the kinds of educational requirements that were typically required for an entry-level position. And we had then classified all of our CTE programs of study as, on the one hand, something more oriented toward the workforce, where the students were potentially had the opportunity to go directly into the labor market after getting a high school diploma. Other programs that were more mixed in the sense that the occupations with which they were aligned typically required some post-secondary education, but not a four-year degree. And then finally, programs that we classify as college-aligned, where they were associated with occupations that typically required at least a bachelor's degree for an entry-level position. And as we break out the more than 80 schools in our sample, and look at the variation in impacts across this combination of the policy context and the occupational alignment, we find some very interesting patterns of effectiveness that are associated with these groupings. Quickly about the study design, Kathy mentioned the idea that the CTERN network is specifically focused on building evidence, causal evidence, about the effectiveness of CTE over and above what students who had access to those programs were likely to have achieved had they not had the opportunity to participate in this. And this study is unique in the sense that it's, first of all, based on a randomized controlled trial naturally occurring that grows out of the New York City high school application process when programs are oversubscribed. The city or the application process utilizes a lottery to determine which among the oversubscribed students are admitted, and then which students need to go to another option on their choice list. We were able to generalize from the group of students and schools that were using these lottery-like admissions processes by using what's called a propensity score matching design, where we use background characteristics and other information from the student high school applications to create a matched comparison group of students who were equivalently interested in these programs but had to be assigned elsewhere. The study also includes rich descriptive information on the CTE programs of study, their implementation, their school contexts, measures of students' exposure to their full range of CTE experiences while they were in high school. And we're able to follow these students at this point through high school, and then for a full 18 months after they were scheduled to graduate from high school to learn about whether they enroll in college, a 2-year or a 4-year college, and how they're accumulating their persistence through the first 3 semesters at least of expected college enrollment if they decided to go in that direction. Importantly, I need to emphasize that we don't yet have any data on students' post-secondary employment and earnings. And for those of you who know the field and the research base, this is a crucially important piece of the puzzle in trying to understand the effectiveness of career and technical education. So hopefully we will be able to continue the work and get access to more information on employment and earnings. So briefly, what we find is a number of things, and I'll sort of connect all the dots on this, but just to sort of give the top line for the key findings is we do see, in keeping with some criticism of career and technical education, a modest trade-off in students earning more CTE credits, but fewer, in some cases, academic credits or other electives. However, that modest trade-off didn't have any impact that we can see on students making progress toward graduation and getting their high school diplomas on time and then subsequently enrolling in college. In fact, what we see is an actual impact, a positive impact on keeping students on track for high school graduation, which in New York State means students need to earn a Regents diploma that requires that they earn a minimum number of credits in concentrated academic areas, and that they pass end of course exams in 5 subjects before they graduate from high school. And so in order to be on pace with that, students need to take a certain number of credits and earn Regents exam credits as they move through school. And we're seeing that the students stay on track. We do see, however, pretty high graduation rates among the students in this sample. However, it's a mix, though, of those higher graduations, in some cases reflecting a positive impact on graduation rates. In other cases, a negative, even though that 70 or 80% of students may graduate from high school within 4 years. The control group or the comparison group may have graduated at a rate of 82 or 83%. And in most cases, however, the effect on graduation rates was neutral or null, where the higher graduation rates among the very high graduation rates among CTE students was comparable to that of students who otherwise went to non-CTE programs. Similarly, on average, we see pretty high college enrollment rates, and again, with a mix of positive, negative, and neutral impacts from CTE. On college enrollments, at least through 18 months after scheduled high school graduation. And again, given that this is an impact study, it's really important to differentiate between outcomes and impacts, where the outcomes are a measure of experiences or behaviors or other sorts of milestones for young people, such as graduating from high school or earning credits or going on to college. High outcomes are a good thing. But from the standpoint of understanding the value added or the real benefit of attending a CTE program, we need to understand its impact. In other words, what is the causal effect of a CTE program on whatever graduation rate those students probably would have achieved without the access to the programs? And again, the primary message through all of this is what we find is substantial variation in CTE implementation and, interestingly, in the impacts. And the short version of the sort of, I think, main theme that arises from that variation is that the CTE programs in the smaller, less selective high schools, and the ones that emphasize careers that required post-secondary education, particularly a 4-year college degree, are the programs that produce the strongest impacts on both students' high school graduation rates and on their enrollment in a 4-year college. And I'll show you some pictures and graphs of that. I'm going to pause here for a minute to see if there's any clarifying questions about the background, the context, the general findings before I move on to some of the details of what the findings look like. Tara or John, if you can just chime in with any sort of questions that came up in the chat, or if folks want to unmute themselves, you can kind of jump in with that. Anything?
We had a couple of questions about the wait list process and how schools might determine the best way for, or what's the most equitable way for moving students from that. John had a response there in the chat, but I don't know if you have another thought. Let me see. The question is, how do non-selective schools enroll students? Is there a uniform system in New York City, or do schools determine their own enrollment procedures? And we had a second question on, is there any research on the best way to select students when there are waiting lists?
Those are all great questions. I'll give a brief answer to that, and I'm happy to talk offline. This is a question that has been nagging at the New York City public schools, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, and the efficacy of using highly selective criteria for many of its schools. But I guess the bottom line is that in general, the schools can decide themselves whether the programs they offer use things like test scores or achievement or grades or even teacher recommendations. But once they make that determination, or whether they're going to be more open enrollment, in other words, that anybody who, they might give a preference to students who live in the local community, but other than that, there are no real selection criteria. Once they make that decision, the application process takes over from there. So students list 12 choices on their applications. That list is in effect sorted randomly so that students get admitted until all the slots fill up. Once the slots all fill up in a given school, no other students can be assigned there. But if there's certain groups of students, like those who live close to the community where there's oversubscription, the lottery kicks in and the schools have no control over that. Now that may be changing over time because they've instituted a wait list system now over the last couple of years that makes that more complicated, so that the injection of this lottery-like process takes on a little bit different form. It's still there, but it goes through multiple layers of students being ranked at random in these waiting lists. In terms of what's best, a lot of that depends on the goals for enrollment and the degree to which schools want to try to advance diversity, either in race, ethnicity, students with disability, language learners, location, so on and so forth. But that's basically, for the purposes of this study, the lotteries that we were using were really among the non-selective schools that didn't have any admissions criteria and that were oversubscribed, and where you can really clearly see that the lottery process resulted in a truly equivalent group of students. About half of which are being admitted to the schools, and the other half, because of the oversubscription, go on about their way. And it really has the kind of equivalence that you hope to get from a randomized controlled trial in a research context. So, but I can sort of cover, if anybody's more interested in how all of that works and sort of what the dynamics of that are, I'm happy to talk a bit about that offline. Any other sort of hot button clarifying issues before I move on? All right, let me press on then, and if folks are muted or whatever, we can try to circle back later. All right, so the first thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is this long-standing criticism, in some cases, of career and technical education, that they force students into kind of a zero-sum choice that either puts them on a track towards a job or some employment-related post-secondary education on the one hand, or that they're going to be able to do the kinds of coursework and other things that get them ready for college. And often what that gets framed as is that it forces students to trade in either academic coursework or other kinds of electives in order to complete their requirements for career and technical education. And that may very well take students off track and prevent them from graduating on time, or if they do graduate on time, maybe prevent them from going to college. And this graph, it tries to show you a bit about what we've learned about that question. And specifically, what you see in the very bottom part of this figure, and this is focusing just for a minute on the CTE dedicated high schools, we see, as expected, a real dramatic increase in the rates at which students are earning CTE credits. On average, kids in this sample are earning a little over 8 credits in CTE. And by the way, in New York City and New York State, a credit is a semester's worth of coursework. Okay, so 2 credits constitutes a full year coursework. 8 credits would constitute 4 full courses. Okay, and that's usually actually above and beyond what would be required for somebody to be a quote concentrator. So at any rate, of course, as you might expect, the kids in our CTE group are much more likely to complete credits in CTE compared to their non-CTE comparison groups. And at the same time, there's a little bit of a reduction in their academic coursework. Instead of earning 34 credits, they're earning roughly 30 credits in English language arts or math, science, social studies, or a world language. And a little bit of a reduction in the arts, which is that light blue third piece of the bar going up. So there is a little bit of this trade-off going on, but nonetheless, the students in the CTE group earn more total credits overall compared to their non-CTE counterparts. And as you'll see in a minute, this had no effect on whether they stayed on track to graduate within 4 years with a Regents diploma, including all the tests that were required, or to go on to college. So I'll show that in just a second. So this is the CTE dedicated high school, and this next slide compares the CTE dedicated high schools on the left and the comprehensive CTE programs in comprehensive high schools on the right. And you see a very similar pattern across the two places. There's not nearly as much of a reduction in the academic coursework for the comprehensive high schools, and you don't see students in our CTE group earning nearly as many credits, even though they earn more than their counterparts. And again, this is another factor that's important to consider in the schooling context, right? In the CTE comprehensive high schools, students are much less likely to take on the CTE requirements, even though they chose a program that offered CTE and enrolled in the school with that program. Once they got themselves into school, it looks like many of these students opted out of the coursework, and other work we've looked at looks at the rates at which they're doing things like internships. And we see much lower rates of that, even though they're getting more of it than they otherwise would had they been in the comparison group. So here there is a little bit of a trade-off between the CTE credits and things like arts and other electives, but overall they're earning the same number of total credits. And as you'll see in the next couple of pictures, it didn't really have any effect on whether or not they graduated on time or went on to college. So let me show you a little bit of that. So this picture shows this, again, this focuses on the CTE dedicated high schools. It shows 6 different points in time, ranging from students' 9th grade year through 18 months following their scheduled graduation. So it follows students through high school until they were scheduled to earn a high school diploma within 4 years. That looks at their first year of following to see whether they enrolled in high school, and then it looks another year out after that to see whether in fact they continued or delayed their enrollment in college. And what we see in the first 3 time points is a consistent difference between or increase in staying on track for graduation. In other words, students in our CTE group were more likely to earn the credits they needed to make sure they were on track to get the full 44 credits for graduation and pass the 5 Regents exams that they needed in order to qualify for a Regents diploma. And in the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, we see that the students in our CTE group were more likely to be on track for graduation, as we call it, compared to the counterfactual of CTE, non-CTE students. However, by the time you get out there to the Regents diploma point at the end of 12th grade, we don't see any systematic difference. The CTE students are about equally likely to graduate on time at a 78% on-time graduation rate, with a roughly 79.5 percentage point graduation rate for the young people in the non-CTE group. Those are not statistically different from each other, and so essentially what we see is a null effect on graduation rates. So that course taking, while it kept them on track, it got them all the students were out the door about the same time. And essentially what we see is that students in the non-CTE group are sort of doing this last minute push to finish out a couple of extra credits that they need and to take the last 1 or 2 Regents exams that they need to qualify for a Regents diploma, while the students in the CTE group were doing that throughout the course of their high school career, so there wasn't this big press at the end of college. We do see in that 5th time point that in the semester immediately following high school graduation, students in the CTE group were slightly less likely to enroll immediately in college, so that 57% of students enrolling in college out of our control group turns out to be a little bit, in the CT group is a little bit lower than the 61% for the non-CTE group. those numbers are reversed. These 57 belongs with the solid blue line. So that's small reduction in graduation rates. However, gets nullified when you look another year out and you see students in the CTE group and the non-CTE group equally likely to have been enrolled in college at some point in the 18 months following their scheduled graduation from high school. So although students in the CTE group were slightly less likely to be enrolled in college in that first semester after graduation, eventually they ended up enrolling in school. And again, what we would like to know is whether those students some of those students opted for work, for example, in the first year following high school in order to put themselves in a better position to go to college a year later than their accompanying cohort. So we don't know that because we don't have any information on employment and earnings. So this is the CTE dedicated high schools. And when we look at both groups together, the top is our CTE dedicated high schools and the bottom is our CTE programs and comprehensive high schools. And we see a pretty similar pattern. The CTE programs and comprehensive high schools don't have that small reduction in college going in the year following scheduled graduation from high school, but ultimately, like both groups, they're equivalent in their college enrollment rates. A couple interesting things to also note about this is that the on-track rates and the graduation rates for the students in the CTE programs and comprehensive high schools are slightly larger than they are for the students in the CTE dedicated high schools. And part of that is because the CTE programs in the comprehensive high schools were more likely, though not exclusively, to be selective programs. So they were picking students based on higher test scores or grades. And many more, not all, but many more of the CTE dedicated high schools were non-selective. And we'll parse that out a little bit when I get to that piece of our subgroup story. But again, the bottom line here we think is that and these are all graduation rates by and large, believe it or not, that are higher than the citywide averages. So these are programs that are attracting students that are more likely to graduate or go on to college than the average student across the system. But the students in the CTE program, end up graduating and going to college at roughly the same rates as their non-CTE counterparts. So I'm going to start talking a bit about variation, but let me pause again for a moment to see if there's any burning questions that I can answer for clarification. Tara or John or unmuted folks?
We just got a question in. Can you clarify the years within the impact data? Was COVID included during this?
Very good. Actually not. So these are students who were applying for high school in the spring of 2013 through the spring of 2016. The last cohort of students was scheduled to graduate in 2020, so they just barely get into the, they've done most of their high school work before COVID. And then that following year, they would have been enrolling in college at the height of the pandemic. So they did most of their high school out, before the pandemic, and then they're starting at least the last cohort, and I guess the earlier cohort starts to sort of interact with that. We don't see a huge variation, however, across these four cohorts of entering ninth grade or applying eighth grade students. We can peel that back a little bit more, but by and large, the patterns we see for the earlier cohorts look pretty similar for the kids in like 2013 and 14, look pretty similar to the ones in 2015, 16, which are the ones that are more likely to be crossing through the pandemic. But that's a good question and probably something for us to look at more carefully. Other questions?
One more clarifying question.
Sure.
Is there variation in the CTE programming offered within the comprehensive schools versus the CTE dedicated schools?
That is a terrific question. And the short answer is absolutely there is. The challenge for our study, however, is it's much more difficult for us to be able to track students' enrollment in a specific program of study because the schools and the New York City public school data systems don't capture this particular program of study within which students may be enrolled. We can find out which courses they're taking and whether or not those courses are aligned with a particular program of study. But by and large, what we've been able to do most reliably is essentially combine the programs of study within a given high school, be it CTE dedicated or comprehensive, and characterize the overall implementation across those, even though we know there's a fair bit of variation within the schools. Now, one of the interesting findings from that analysis that does try to look at least at the implementation within schools, even if we can't tell how much variation there is at the student level, is that the schools that were opened after 2002, or the CTE dedicated high schools opened after 2008, tend to be much more focused. Those are much more coherent. Those are even if they have multiple programs, they're mostly centered around a STEM or a tech or a health professions or a services-oriented set of occupations or themes. Whereas in the older, larger comprehensive high schools particularly, but even the CTE dedicated high schools, they're much more eclectic. There's much more variation across themes and maybe even in implementation in those older, longer standing programs. And part of that starts to come out in what we see in both the implementation analysis and, importantly, in the impact analysis, which is what I'll start talking about next. All right, let me mush on here. So I'm going to first of all just give you some pictures that give you a sense for how much variation there's going on across the 88 high schools that we have in this sample. Now this is a picture of the percentage of students in each school that earned a minimum of 6 or more credits in CTE during high school. And 6 or more credits is the typical CTE concentrator benchmark at the federal level and particularly and at the New York State level. We've also looked at 4 or more credits, which is a requirement for a CTE certified diploma in New York State. But here's the percentage of students earning 6 or more CTE credits. And again, remember that would be 3 full year CTE courses. And you can see it ranges from very, very few of the students in some of the high schools, less than 10%, all the way up through a number of programs where 70% of more of the students who enrolled in the 9th grade ended up earning 6 or more credits. The green line here, the 21.9%, is the average for our for the CTE programs in our comprehensive high schools, and 46.3% is the average for the high schools, the CTE dedicated high schools. So you can see on average, the CTE dedicated high schools are much more likely to ensure that students who opt for their CTE programs end up completing those 6 or more credits, even though it's less than half. And then fewer than a quarter of the students on average across the CTE programs in comprehensive high schools are earning that 6 or more credits. But the point here is this is a tremendous amount of variation. Similarly, we are able to get information on students engaging in an internship. And that internship could be paid, or it could be an internship for which they're getting school credit. And again, it ranges from a number of schools where fewer than 10% of the students who are opting for those programs doing an internship, compared to a batch that were more than half had done an internship. And the average for our CTE dedicated high schools is about 26%. And for the CTE programs in comprehensive high schools, it's about 18%. So again, pretty wide disparity overall, and on average, quite a difference between the CTE dedicated high schools and the comprehensive high schools. This is a picture of the impact for each of the 88 schools in our sample. So the red dots here represent the average impact on the rates at which students, the CTE students in that program or in those schools, are going on to a 4-year college program. Compared to the comparison group or the counterfactual or the control group for each of those schools. So this is the difference for each school between its CTE group and its control group. That's what the dots represent. And then these bars represent the sort of uncertainty or the standard errors, the variation around that. And what you're looking for here are places where the bars around the dots are either fully above or below that 0 line. Those are estimates that we have a fair bit of confidence is a real non-zero difference. And you can see on the right-hand side of this figure, there's a number of programs that have had a pretty substantial positive impact on the rates at which students are enrolling in a 4-year college within 18 months of finishing high school. And many of those schools are statistically different. The impact in those schools is statistically different from 0, while there's a number of schools on the left-hand side of the graph where the impact or the CTE programs actually reduced the likelihood in a causal framework. They reduced the likelihood of students going on to a 4-year college within 18 months of graduating from high school. And this is the kind of variation I think that is the most compelling for a study like this, to really want to and push itself to explore what is it that differentiates the schools and the programs on the right-hand side of the graph from the schools and the programs on the left-hand side of the graph. And the ones in the middle, there's not enough uncertainty about whether those are real differences from 0, but nonetheless, that sort of null effect can also be a useful source of variation. But again, what we're really trying to understand is what are the conditions under which schools are able to actually increase enrollment in 4-year colleges, and what are the conditions under which programs may very well reduce the likelihood of going on to a 4-year college, at least within 18 months of high school, and what else might be going on? Is that really a signal that students are opting for the labor market or for some other option, or is it that they are left with very few options once they finish high school? And for us, rather than just do a data mining exercise where we run around saying, well, let's just find out who all those schools are on the right-hand side and see what holds them all together. That's kind of a fishing expedition for which I think real credibility could be brought into question, because we put ourselves at risk of finding our favorite answer, or our answer that really is most interesting to us, rather than something for which we've got a strong prior hypothesis that we can test with our data and see whether or not that is a systematic difference. So what we've done is even before we tried to figure out, once we saw that variation, rather than even acknowledging or identifying the individual schools on that graph, we came up with some hypotheses about the policy context and about occupational alignment that would differentiate among these schools, and secondly might explain some of the difference between the right-hand side of the graph and the left-hand side of the graph. So quickly, on the policy side, as I mentioned earlier, New York City has undergone this dramatic transformation of its high school system, beginning in 2002 and really accelerating with CTE in 2008. The city was in the midst of creating over 200 new schools that were smaller and not using non-selective admissions criteria. And in the meantime, during that period, there was a number of longstanding programs that continued to offer CTE, but those tended to be much, much larger, large sort of comprehensive high schools, and in some cases, large CTE high schools. And many of those were using selective admissions criteria, and their career themes were pretty widely ranging, whereas the smaller programs were much more concentrated. At the same time, both within and across that classification of small, non-selective, or selective and larger, we see real differences in the alignment between the career themes and the occupations that students could be oriented to. And specifically, we looked at the alignment with occupations that would provide access to an entry-level job that required different education credentials. So one group of schools we are classifying as work-ready, and these are programs that are typically aligned with occupations that would require only a high school diploma for young people to get access to an entry-level job. Mixed are programs that would be aligned with occupations that might require some post-secondary education, but not a 4-year degree. And then the college-aligned programs are ones that would require, aligned with occupations that would require more of at least a bachelor's degree or higher. And we divide that up into a total of kind of up to 6 different groups for the CTE dedicated high schools, or 6 groups for this comprehensive high schools, we start to see some interesting patterns of difference in impact. So let's look at the college aligned programs in the CTE dedicated high schools, okay? And we'll look specifically at the college aligned programs that were newer and smaller and using non-selective admissions criteria. Okay, so these are the CTE dedicated high schools that were created after 2008, didn't use a selective admissions criteria, and were quite small. They would have for example, a 9th grade class of 100 or 110 students at most. And here's where we see some pretty strong positive effects on college. For now, we'll look at the enrollment in a 4-year college. Okay. Overall, we do see an overall positive impact on college going of about 9 percentage points. 73% of the students in the CTE group from these schools enrolled in college, in a 4-year college, within 18 months of graduating from high school, compared to 65% of the students in the control group. That's an 8 percentage point difference overall. But almost all of that difference is located in the bottom part of the graph here. So 46% of those students are going on to a 4-year college, compared to 37% of the control group. And that 8 or 9 percentage point difference is statistically significant and quite large if you have a chance to look at other studies looking at enrollments in 4-year colleges. And so again, these are the smaller, less selective, college-aligned CTE dedicated high schools. Now we see a similar but much more muted pattern in the comprehensive high school. So on the right-hand side of the graph, you see we've got on the right-hand side, and the right-hand side of that graph, we've got college-aligned programs from the newer, smaller, less selective high schools. Again, it's a small positive improvement or increase in college going, which is spread across both the 2 and the 4-year colleges. A positive but not statistically significant difference in the college-aligned programs from those later, larger, more selective schools. Interestingly, none of the new CTE high schools, none of the older CTE dedicated high schools were college-aligned, interestingly. So that's why there's only one set of graphs there. And I'm seeing Tara come on, which I think means she's trying to signal me that I should try to wrap things up so we can have a conversation, right? Oh yeah, I'm right at the end here. I'll flip through these others and I'll just kind of cut myself off. Here's a look at our impact on college and alignment among these, what we call mixed alignment. And here we see a mix of positive and negative. So you see, and most of this is associated with the size of the school and its selectivity, and not quite as much with their alignment. But for the work-aligned programs, here's where we see a fairly consistent pattern of negative effects on college going. And again, we don't know whether this is because students, because they have better access to a job right after high school, they may be opting for employment prior to going to college, or prior to combining school and work. And again, this is a big open question. It's really hard to draw any definitive conclusions from this. Let me just stop talking, even though there's probably a lot more I could be covering, and see what we can do to try to answer more questions or have a bit more of a conversation. Tara?
Yeah, there's questions in the chat here wondering about if you looked at students going into 2-year colleges. I see on this slide here you do have some of the 2-year enrollment is here. So the questions are, is there a comparable look at going to any college, not just limiting to 4-year, and considering that numerous CTE opportunities exist within community colleges, did you track impact of enrollment on community college?
Yeah, so all of these graphs, when you all get them, and when you look at our reports, you'll see we do differentiate between 2- and 4-year colleges, and then overall, and here we even look at students who are going to both a 2-year and a 4-year, usually transferring from a 2-year to a 4-year. You should all know, or anybody who knows the New York City context, the City University of New York offers a total of 28 different colleges and universities, little more than half of those are two-year colleges. And that's pretty much, if you see two-year colleges, it's all City University of New York two-year colleges. And some of that facilitates the transfer from two-year to four-year. But again, we're looking at two-year, four-year, and some combination of those over the 18 months following high school graduation. Usually when we see an impact on college going, though, it's been concentrated in the four-year college enrollment rates. With a few examples, for example, on this slide here, we do see some change, sometimes positive, sometimes slightly negative in the rates at which students go on to a two-year college, but most of the action looks like on whether or not the treatment and control group go on to a four-year college when we see an impact. Other questions, comments, thoughts, help?
A new one just came in. Are post-graduation registered apprenticeships and trade schools considered in your post-secondary education?
Trade schools are, apprenticeships would not be. Basically, our data come from a combination of the City University of New York, provides us with access to information on students from New York City who end up enrolling in a CUNY school, and the National Student Clearinghouse, which does include many trade schools if it's an authorized degree granting institution, but not apprenticeships, not other kinds of formal kind of work-related training. That's another potential limitation of our data here.
And one last question, thinking about this in conjunction with the MDRC Small Schools of Choice research, is it hard to disentangle the two?
It surely is. This is a question, obviously, for someone who's been paying pretty close attention to New York City-based research. And yeah, I mean, number one, the findings are very consistent across the two studies. We do seem to find that the smaller, less selective programs, all of which are the New York City small schools of choice that MDRC focused on, are more likely to produce the positive effects. We are comparing them with a slightly different group of students who are opting for CTE programs in particular. And ours are focused on the CTE dedicated high schools. So we're excluding a number of the other MDRC small schools, and we still see some positive effects. The effects here are not nearly as robust or as large as the MDRC study found. So there are some differences. But again, we do know that that the notion of smallness, non-selectivity, new schools is an important ingredient in what seems to be a condition under which CTE is more effective.
Thank you so much, Jim. This has been fantastic. I want to let everyone know again that we will be posting slides and the recording from today's conversation on the CTE Research Network website. I just put that link in the chat. We do have another webinar in our series. So Tuesday, March 5th, we will be hearing from two of our studies that have both explored the impact of CTE and dual enrollment. We really hope that you're able to join us then. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And if other folks have comments, please shoot me an email or get in contact in other ways. I'd love to hear ideas that folks have. We've got an extraordinary database here that I think warrants lots more research and lots more analysis. And we're always looking for folks who've got good ideas about how best to do that.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you all.
Take care.